My name is Reza Ahmadi. I am 32 years old now. My identical twin brother is Seed Ahmadi. We were born 7 minutes apart on a cold morning in January 1994 in Isfahan, Iran. The regime ordered our public execution because we protested. But Jesus intervened and saved us in a way that still makes my hands tremble when I talk about it. We really thought we would be dead by now. When all hope was gone, Jesus saved us from the hands of death. In the year 2023, the world watched as the Islamic Republic of Iran executed protesters in public, men who only raised their voices against a government that crushed its own people for years. 8 men were hanged because of the protests. Their deaths were shown as warnings. Human rights groups spoke out. Governments made statements. The United Nations asked for answers. But the Iranian regime did not stop. What the world did not know is that the list of men who were supposed to die was longer than 8. Seed and I were on that list. We were supposed to be number 9 and number 10. We were supposed to be hanged in a public square in Tehran. That was the message they wanted to send to every Iranian who dreamed of freedom. But we are alive. And the reason we are alive is not because of a lawyer or a campaign or any government talk. We are alive because Jesus Christ stepped in. This is our story. We tell it so the world will know that no regime, no matter how strong or how hard, has the last word. God does. I still feel my heart race when I remember that cold morning we were born. Our mother Nasrin told us she laughed through her tears because we looked so much the same that even she could not tell us apart at first. Our father Fahd put small ink marks on our wrists so the nurses would not mix us up. That was the start of a whole life where people looked at us and saw one person in 2 bodies. We grew up in a simple but warm apartment in the Jolfa area of Isfahan. It was an old neighborhood with history. Our father loved history and old buildings. He said a man who lives near beautiful old things never forgets that the world is bigger than his own life. Our father was a teacher of literature and language at the University of Isfahan. He was not a political man. He loved books and ideas. He believed education was the strongest tool a person could have. He taught his students to think carefully, to ask questions, to look at words and meaning. His students liked him. His co-workers respected him. But in Iran, a man who teaches people to think for themselves is always a risk to a government that stays in power by controlling what people think. Our mother Nasrin taught Persian literature and history in a girls' school. She was softer than our father, but just as strong in her beliefs. She believed deeply that girls and women should learn. She often said the most powerful thing a person could do in Iran was to teach a girl to read and to think and to know her own value. She was a Muslim. Her faith was quiet and private. It was not the kind the regime used to control people. She prayed, she fasted, she wore her hijab. But she never used religion to hurt anyone or to keep people silent. She raised her 3 sons the same way. Our older brother Darius was born in 1990. He was the serious one, the deep thinker, the one who asked questions that made our father stop and think again. The 3 of us grew up in a home full of books and talk, and the smell of our mothers cooking on Friday afternoons. We were raised as Muslims, but our home was never hard or extreme. Our parents prayed and kept the main religious rules, but they also asked questions and left room for doubt in a country where doubt was dangerous. Darius was the first of us to start questioning the regime openly long before Seed, and I fully understood politics. He was always restless, always looking for something the world around him did not give. We were close as brothers, but Darius moved in a slightly different way, always reaching for something the rest of us could not yet see. Then in 2020, the regime took everything from us. Our parents had been watched quietly for years without us knowing. The government had been listening to our father's classes, watching the talks he had with students, watching our mother's school, noting the ideas she gave the girls she taught. One evening in March 2022, men came to the apartment and said our parents needed to answer some questions. It sounded normal, but it never is. Our parents gathered their things calmly. They told Darius, who was visiting that night, not to worry. They kissed Seed and me goodbye and walked out. We never saw them again. For weeks we got no news. The authorities said they were being held for checking. Then the news stopped. Phone calls got no answer. Official questions got silence or denial. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years. Slowly through the quiet networks that Iranians use to share truths the government hides, we learned what happened. Our parents had been killed in secret by a regime that saw their work in education and free thinking as a danger. To this day, the Islamic Republic of Iran has never said they died. They deny it completely. 2 teachers, 2 parents, 2 people erased from the official record as if they never lived. The death of our parents broke us in different ways. For Seed and me, the pain turned almost at once into anger. We became enemies of the Islamic State, not loud at first, but in the deep, cold, careful way that men become enemies when something that cannot be replaced is taken from them. We put our anger into resistance. We connected with journalists, human rights groups, and activist groups that were recording the regime's crimes. Darius's response was different, and at the time we did not understand it at all. He disappeared for several months. When he came back, he was a changed man. He told us he had found a group of Christians meeting in secret in Tehran. In his darkest moment of grief and anger, he had met Jesus Christ. He said Jesus had come to him personally. He said Jesus had spoken to him. He said Jesus had filled him with a peace he could not explain and could not deny. He said the Holy Spirit had entered him and changed his grief into something he could carry. He had started sharing the gospel with people in the underground Christian community, praying over sick people, leading others to faith. He was full of a strong belief that Seed and I found completely strange to everything we knew. He sat with us one evening and begged us with tears in his eyes to stop feeding our pain with anger and political resistance. He said the regime wanted us to be eaten by hatred because hatred would destroy us just as sure as any hanging. He said Jesus was the only one who could heal what was broken inside us. He said the work of Christ was stronger than any protest. He held our hands and said, "Please come to Jesus. Let him carry this. Let him turn your pain into something that does not kill you." Seed and I listened with respect because we loved our brother, but we could not take what he offered. Our parents had been killed by men who used God as a weapon. The last thing either of us wanted was more God. We thanked Darius for his care. We told him we were glad he found his peace. Then we turned back to the only answer that made sense to us. We turned back to the fight. The months after we said no to Darius were some of the most focused and dangerous of our lives. Seed and I put everything we had into the resistance. We were not foolish. We knew the risks. We had watched the regime take our parents without a trace. We knew exactly what the Islamic Republic could do to people who stood against it. But the grief inside us had hardened into something that made fear feel small. When you have already lost the people who mattered most, the way you measure risk changes completely. We were careful. We built relationships slowly. We moved carefully. We learned the ways of underground resistance, the way our father taught us to learn any language. Step by step, patient, with full attention to detail. We connected with journalists working for international news, human rights groups recording the regime's abuses, activist networks inside and outside Iran. We became good at moving information past the digital walls the regime built to keep truth inside the country. We used encrypted messages, VPN services, changing contacts to send proof of government abuses to media groups in Europe and North America. We were building towards something. We did not know exactly what form it would take, but when the moment came, we were ready. That moment arrived on September 16, 2023. A young woman named Mahsa Amini was detained by the morality police for what they called improper hijab. She was taken to a re-education center. Within hours, she was in a coma. 3 days later, she was dead. The regime said she had a heart attack. Her family and witnesses said she was beaten. Medical signs supported the family, the marks on her body, the brain injury, the way she collapsed. All told a story the official words could not hold. When the news of her death spread across Iran, it was like fire in a dry place. Protests started in every one of Iran's 31 provinces. Women stood in the streets and took off their hijabs. They cut their hair in public. They burned their headscarves while crowds chanted around them. The words that united everything were 3 words in Kurdish: woman, life, freedom. Those 3 words became the strongest political statement in the country, chanted in Persian and Kurdish. Spread across every social media platform Iranians could reach, even while the regime tried to shut down the internet completely. Seed and I were in Tehran when Mahsa Amini died. We had moved from Isfahan to Tehran 2 years earlier to be closer to the activist networks we worked with. We lived in a small apartment in the Yousefabad area. When the protests started, we did not wait even one moment. This was exactly what we had been building toward. This was the moment when the anger that had lived inside us since the night our parents walked out of that apartment in Isfahan and never came back could finally take a shape that meant something. We were at the first major protest in Tehran on September 17, 2023, standing in the crowd on Keshavarz Boulevard as hundreds of young Iranians chanted and cried and raised their fists. We filmed everything on our phones. We recorded the faces of the security forces. We filmed the moment the riot police arrived with batons and tear gas. We recorded the sound of shots being fired into crowds. Within hours of filming, we sent everything to our contacts outside Iran through encrypted ways, making sure the world could see what was happening in real time before the regime could hide the images. Over the following weeks, Seed and I became some of the most active links between the protests on the ground in Tehran and the international media covering the uprising from outside Iran. We worked with journalists from BBC Persian, Radio Farda, Iran International, all outlets the regime called hostile foreign groups. Their local contacts faced serious danger if found. We understood the risk of every message we sent. We understood that the regime's intelligence groups were actively hunting for people exactly like us. We used multiple phones, changed our SIM cards often, moved between different places to avoid patterns that watchers could notice. But we also became braver as the weeks passed because the size of what we were seeing demanded bravery. We were seeing young people shot in the streets of Iranian cities. We were getting reports of children being killed by security forces. We were recording a slow killing of the Iranian people. The idea of being careful while that was happening felt like turning away from every person dying in those streets. The regime's answer to the protests was exactly what anyone who knew the Islamic Republic would expect. It was hard, organized, without any mercy. Security forces fired live bullets into crowds in cities across the country. Human rights groups recorded over 500 protester deaths by the end of the uprising. Among the dead were children, some as young as 10 years old. More than 20,000 people were arrested. The charges against arrested protesters went from disturbing public order to the much heavier charge of enmity against God, a charge that carries the death penalty under Iranian law. It was the charge used to justify the hanging of the 8 protesters who died in the months after the uprising. Men whose deaths brought international blame and briefly made the world look at what the regime was doing before the news moved on and Iran's killing continued in the dark. We were arrested on the 23rd of November 2023. It happened in the early hours of the morning, the time the regime likes for arrests because the dark gives cover and the tiredness of sleep makes fighting harder. We had gone to bed in our apartment after a long night of sending footage from a protest near Azadi Square. We had been asleep for only about 2 hours when the door broke in. There were 6 of them. All men in plain clothes with the practiced skill of people who had done this many times. They did not say who they were, they did not show papers, they pulled us from our beds, put restraints on our wrists, covered our heads with cloth bags, walked us out of the apartment into waiting cars. We did not fight. There was no point. We had always known this moment might come. In a way, we had been preparing for it, since the night our parents were taken in the exact same way from the apartment in Isfahan. The cars drove for about 40 minutes before stopping. When the bags were taken from our heads, we were inside the processing area of Evin prison, the most feared detention place in Iran, a place whose name alone is enough to make the blood of any Iranian run cold. Evin sits in the foothills of the Alborz Mountains in northwestern Tehran. A large complex of buildings surrounded by high walls and watchtowers that has held political prisoners, journalists, activists, and people who disagreed for decades. It is a place where people go in and do not always come out. And it was the place where Seed and I would spend the next several months waiting to find out if we would live or die. The weeks after our arrest were a mix of questioning, isolation, and mental pressure. We were questioned separately for the first 2 weeks, held in single cells, denied access to lawyers, put through hours of questioning sessions where officers from the Ministry of Intelligence showed proof of our activities, our messages with foreign media, our roles in organizing and recording the protests. They had been watching us longer than we knew. They had our phone records. our encrypted messages. Records of our contacts with international journalists. The case against us was full and damaging by the standards of the revolutionary court that would try us. We were formally charged with enmity against God and corruption on earth. The two charges most often used to justify the execution of political prisoners in Iran. After 2 weeks of being alone, we were put together in a shared cell in Ward 209 of Evin Prison, the ward controlled by the Ministry of Intelligence and one of the most feared parts of the whole place. When the cell door opened and I saw Seed standing there looking thinner and more tired than I had ever seen him, I felt something break open in my chest. We held each other in that small grey cell and neither of us spoke for a long time. We did not need to. We were alive. We were together, and whatever was coming, we would face it the same way we had faced everything since the day we entered the world 7 minutes apart, side by side. Ward 209 of Evin Prison is not a place made for human beings to live in. It is a place made to break them. The cell Seed and I shared was small, about 3 meters by 2 meters. Walls painted grey so long ago that the paint had cracked and peeled in long strips, showing the bare concrete under. There was a single narrow window set high in the wall, not high enough to see through properly. It let a thin line of light into the cell for a few hours each day before the shadow of the wall outside covered it again. There were 2 thin mattresses on the floor, 1 blanket each, a small squat toilet in the corner behind a low wall that gave almost no privacy, a tap that gave water in irregular bursts that we quickly learned to time our drinking and washing around. The door was heavy steel with a small slot at the bottom through which food was pushed twice a day. A bowl of watery rice in the morning, a piece of bread with a small portion of beans or lentils in the evening. The food was not enough, but we ate every bite because we understood that keeping physical strength was a kind of resistance in a place made to make you feel completely without power. The sounds of Evin were their own kind of pain. At night the prison was never truly quiet. We could hear footsteps in the corridor outside our cell at all hours, the heavy careful footsteps of guards doing their rounds, the lighter, more urgent footsteps of prisoners being moved from one place to another. We heard doors opening and closing through the night, the metal sound of cell doors being unlocked and locked again echoing through the ward like a slow, irregular heartbeat. Sometimes we heard voices, muffled and unclear, coming from other cells or from somewhere deeper in the prison. Occasionally we heard something that sounded like crying, a sound so raw and private that hearing it through a concrete wall felt wrong. Once in our second week in Ward 209, we heard screaming from somewhere in the building. It lasted for several minutes and then stopped sudden. Seed and I looked at each other in the darkness of our cell and neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say. We both knew what Evin was. We had known its name our whole lives. Hearing its reality was different from knowing it in the mind, but we could not let it stop us. So we took in the sounds and we held on to each other and we kept breathing. The questioning continued even after we were put together in the shared cell. Guards would come without warning at any hour, day or night, and take one of us for questioning while the other stayed alone in the cell waiting. The sessions were held in a room on a lower floor of Ward 209, a bare room with a table, 2 chairs, and a single light above. The questioners were always the same 2 men. One was soft-spoken and almost polite. The kind of man who offers you tea before asking questions meant to send you to the gallows. The other was louder and more hard, given to sudden bursts of anger when answers did not please him. We later understood this was a planned method, a show designed to keep prisoners off balance, never knowing which version of their captors they would meet on any given day. The questions were always about our contacts, our methods, our networks. They wanted names. They wanted to know who inside Iran had been helping us talk with international media. They wanted the identities of our sources, the people who had been sending us footage and information from cities across the country. Seed and I had agreed before our arrest, in the quiet understanding that exists between twins who have shared everything since birth, that if this day ever came, we would give them nothing. We kept that agreement through every session, no matter what the questioners threatened. The formal sentencing came in January 2024. About 6 weeks after our arrest, we were taken separately to the Revolutionary Court, a court that works outside the normal Iranian law and exists mainly as a way for the regime to make the punishment of its political enemies look legal. The hearings lasted less than 20 minutes for each of us. There was no real legal help. The charges of enmity against God and corruption on earth had already been decided. The proof shown was the records of our activist work, our messages with foreign media, our roles in the protests. The judge, a cleric in black robes sitting behind a high desk, read the verdict in a flat voice as if he were reading a shopping list. Reza Ahmadi guilty on all charges, sentenced to death. The words landed in my chest like stones dropping into still water. I did not show any reaction because I had promised myself I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing my fear. But inside, everything went very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when the brain gets information too big to handle right away and simply shuts down its extra functions to deal with the shock. I was 30 years old, and a court had just decided I should die. When Seed and I were brought back together in our cell after our separate hearings, we sat on our mattresses facing each other for a long time without speaking. His face told me everything I needed to know about what happened in his hearing. The verdict had been the same. We were both condemned. We were both going to be executed in public. The regime's preferred way for political prisoners whose deaths it wanted to use as messages to the people. Public execution in Iran is done by hanging. Usually from a crane in a public space, a square or a street where ordinary people can be forced to watch. The 8 protesters who had already been executed because of the Mahsa Amini uprising had died this way, their bodies lifted into the air in front of crowds as a show of the regime's full power over the lives of those who stood against it. That was the death that had been given to us. We sat in our cell and we looked at each other, and I thought about our parents, about the night they walked out of the apartment in Isfahan and never came back, about the fact that they had been killed by the same regime in secret while we were about to be killed by it in public. There was a hard difference in that I could not stop turning over in my mind. The part of Evin prison where condemned prisoners were held was different from Ward 209 in ways that were clear right away. It was quieter, which sounds like it should be better, but was actually worse. The quiet was the quiet of men who had stopped expecting anything. We were moved there in late January 2024, and within the first few days, we understood the special mental weight of living in a space where everyone around you has been told they are going to die. There were about 15 other men in the condemned section when we arrived. Some had been there for months. Their execution dates set and then delayed, and then set again in the slow rhythm the regime used to keep maximum mental pressure on its prisoners. We learned their stories in pieces through whispered talks during the short times we were allowed out of our cells for exercise in a small closed courtyard. There was a young man from Mashhad named Reza who had been arrested for throwing stones at a police car during a protest. There was a teacher from Tabriz named Omid who had been charged with organizing demonstrations at his school. There were others whose stories were equally ordinary by any fair standard of justice and equally terrible by the standards being used on them by the revolutionary court. The presence of these men around us made everything more real in a way that our own sentencing had not quite done. Knowing that you are going to die is one thing. Living next to other people who are also going to die, watching their faces across a small concrete courtyard every morning, learning the sound of their voices and the special way each of them carried the weight of their situation. That is something else completely. It made the idea solid. It made the future close. And it took away the last bits of the mental distance that people naturally keep between themselves and the reality of their own death. Seed and I talked more during those weeks than we had ever talked in our lives. We talked about our parents, about Isfahan, about the apartment in Jolfa with the books on every shelf and the smell of our mother's cooking. We talked about our childhood, about school, about the small ordinary memories that feel small when life is normal and become precious beyond measure when life is running out. We talked about Darius. We talked about what he had said to us. About his plea for us to bring our pain to Jesus. About the peace he had described finding in the underground church in Tehran. We had pushed his words away when he spoke them. But lying on thin mattresses in the condemned section of Evin prison, with the sounds of the prison moving around us in the darkness, his words came back to us with a weight they had not carried before. We could not explain why, but both of us felt it. Something about what Darius had said was beginning very slowly and very quietly to make a kind of sense that it had not made when we were free men with the freedom to choose our own pain. The talk Seed and I had about Darius in those final weeks before our scheduled execution were different from any talks we had ever had about him before. When he had come to us with his story about Jesus, when he had sat across from us with tears in his eyes begging us to bring our pain to Christ, we had listened with the polite but firm resistance of men who had made up their minds. We were not against him. We loved our brother. But we were held by a rage so full and so justified that anything like giving up, even giving up to God, felt like turning away from our parents and everything they had suffered. Faith felt like weakness. Prayer felt like doing nothing. And doing nothing felt like agreeing with the regime that had killed them. So we had turned away from what Darius was offering and gone back to the fight. But now in the darkness of the condemned cell something shifted. One night after the lights were out, we began to speak quietly into the dark, not with the formal words of religion we had grown up with, just honest words directed at a person we were not even sure existed. We took turns speaking quietly into the darkness of our cell, asking Jesus if he was real, telling him what had happened to our parents, telling him where we were and what was coming. Asking him if he had anything to do with the peace that lived in our brother's eyes. We did not feel anything big that night. There was no warmth in our chests, no voice from heaven, no sign, but something about the act of speaking honestly into the darkness without the frame of religious duty felt different from anything we had done before. It felt like reaching, and reaching even into darkness felt better than lying still and waiting to die. 4 days before our scheduled execution, we both fell asleep earlier than usual. The physical tiredness of weeks of little sleep and little food had finally overcome even the worry that had been keeping us awake. I do not know exactly what time the dream began. I only know that when it came, it was unlike any dream I had ever had in my life. It did not have the unclear, uncertain quality of ordinary dreams where places shift without reason and faces change into other faces and the story falls apart and comes back without order. This dream was sharp. It was clear and stable and detailed in the way that waking reality is detailed. It had weight and texture and the special solid feeling of something that is actually happening rather than being imagined. I was aware inside the dream that I was seeing something real, something being shown to me on purpose, something that had a purpose beyond the random working of a sleeping brain. In the dream, I saw a room. It was a simple room, the kind of modest inside that marks the private homes where Iran's underground Christian communities gather. Bare walls, a worn carpet on the floor, a few plastic chairs arranged in a rough circle, a single lamp giving warm yellow light against the darkness outside the windows. There were people in the room, about 10 or 12 of them, men and women sitting in the circle with their eyes closed and their faces lifted a little upward. And at the center of the circle, standing with his hands raised toward the ceiling, was Darius. Our brother looked the way he always looked in those years after his change, older than his age in some ways, but lighter too, as if something heavy had been taken from him and he had not yet fully adjusted to the absence of the weight. His eyes were closed and his lips were moving, and I could hear what he was saying. He was praying. He was calling the name of Jesus over and over. His voice steady and full of a surety that had no room for doubt inside it. He was saying, Jesus, my brothers are condemned. Jesus, the regime has sentenced them to death. Jesus, you are the God who opens prison doors. You are the God who walks into condemned cells. You are the God who breaks every chain. I am asking you, I am begging you, reach into that prison and save my brothers, save Reza and Seed. You have the power. You have always had the power. Do it, Lord. Do it now. The prayer continued for what felt like a long time in the dream. The other people in the circle were praying too, their voices joining Darius's in a quiet shared prayer that filled the room with a sound like water moving over stones. And then the room changed. The walls seemed to brighten as if the lamp had been replaced by something far more powerful. The people in the circle faded from the front, and it was just Darius standing in the light. And he was no longer praying with his eyes closed. He was looking directly at me. He was smiling, not the polite social smile that people show each other in ordinary life, but a deep, full smile that came from somewhere certain and unshakable. The smile of a man who has just received news so good that his entire face cannot hold it. He looked at me, and in Farsi, in the exact rhythm and tone of his voice that I had known my entire life, he showed me that Jesus had saved our lives. The storm was over. And then I woke up. I sat up on my mattress with my heart pounding and my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The cell was dark. The prison sounds moved around us in their usual rhythms. Everything looked exactly as it always did. But the dream was still fully present in my mind, every detail intact, every word clear. I looked across the cell at Seed's mattress and found him already sitting up, already awake. Already looking at me with an expression on his face that I recognized right away because it was the same expression I could feel on my own face. Wide eyes, open mouth, the look of a man who has just experienced something that has broken the frame through which he understood reality. Before I could speak, Seed said one word. He said, "Darius." And I said, "You saw it too." He said, "The room, the prayer meeting." I said he was calling the name of Jesus. Seed said he looked at us. I said he was smiling. And then together in the same breath, we both said the words our brother had shown us at the end of the dream. "Jesus has saved your lives. The storm is over." We sat facing each other in the darkness of our cell in the condemned section of Evan prison, and we wept, not from fear or grief or anger, the feelings that had marked every tear we had shed in that place. We wept from something we had no previous experience of and therefore no immediate name for. It took us several minutes of sitting with the feeling before we were able to name it. It was hope. The hope that the dream planted inside us was fragile at first, the way all hope is fragile when it grows in a place designed to kill it. Seed and I spent the hours after waking from the dream sitting on our mattresses talking in low voices about what we had seen and what it meant. We were not simple men. We had not been raised to accept things without looking carefully. Our father had spent his entire career teaching people to think carefully, and that instinct lived in us as naturally as breathing. So we did not simply decide that the dream was a message from God and give our thinking minds to it without question. We examined it. We turned it over carefully the way our father used to turn over a difficult text, looking at it from every side, testing if it held together, asking the hard questions. Was it possible that we had simply dreamed the same dream by chance? Two tired and terrified men whose minds had built an identical vision out of the same raw material of memory and longing. Possible, yes, but the exactness of it was hard to explain away. Every detail had been the same: the room, the people in the circle, the lamp, the sound of the prayer, the specific words Darius had spoken, the exact tone of his voice, the smile on his face. We had compared notes right after waking, and there was not a single difference between what I had seen and what Seed had seen. Two separate sleeping minds had produced one identical experience down to the last detail. The chance of that happening by pure coincidence felt extremely small. We also talked about the prayers we had offered in the days before the dream. We had prayed to Jesus quietly and honestly without expectation, reaching into darkness without knowing if anything was there to receive our reaching. And 3 nights after those prayers, this dream had come. We were not ready to call it proof, not yet, but we were ready to call it a response. Something had heard us, something had answered, and the answer had come in the form of our brother's face. The face of the man who had been trying to tell us about Jesus for years, the man we had pushed away, the man whose peace we had misread as weakness and whose faith we had mistaken for escape. Darius had been right about something. We did not yet know the full extent of what he had been right about, but we knew enough to know that whatever he had found in that underground prayer room in Tehran was connected to what we had just experienced in our cell. The gap between his world and ours had just closed in the space of a single shared dream, and we were not the same men we had been when we fell asleep. We did not sleep again that night. We sat awake until the grey line of morning light appeared in the high narrow window of our cell, and the prison began its slow, noisy process of waking up around us. We talked and we prayed. This time the praying came more naturally than it had before the dream. We were still not fluent in the language of Christian prayer, still reaching for words and forms that felt real rather than borrowed, but the reaching itself felt different now. It felt less like sending a message into empty space and more like speaking to someone who was genuinely present. Someone who had already shown their awareness of our situation in the most specific and undeniable way possible. We thanked Jesus for the dream. We told him we believed he was real. We told him we did not fully understand who he was or what following him meant, but that we wanted to know. We told him that if the dream was true, if the storm was really over, then we would spend whatever life remained to us telling people what had happened in this cell. We made that promise in the darkness of Evan prison one day before our scheduled execution, and we meant every word of it. The morning of the day before our execution was the same as any other morning in the condemned section. The food slot at the bottom of our door opened at the usual time, and the usual bowl of watery rice was pushed through. The sounds of the prison moved around us in their familiar patterns. No one came to speak to us. No one noted that the following morning was the morning we were scheduled to die. That was one of the special cruelties of the Iranian prison system. The complete absence of any formal recognition of what was happening to you. There was no chaplain, no final talk, no human gesture toward the size of what was being done. You were simply a name on a list, and the list was being worked through. And when your name came up, the door would open and you would be taken. We had watched it happen to other men in the condemned section. We knew exactly how it worked. We sat on our mattresses and we prayed and we waited and we held onto the words from the dream, the way a drowning man holds onto a piece of wood in open water. Jesus has saved your lives. The storm is over. We repeated those words to each other through the morning, not as a magic formula, but as a statement of the faith we were choosing in the absence of any visible proof that things were about to change. The change came in the afternoon. We became aware of it first through sound, the way you become aware of most things in prison, through the special quality of movement and voice in the corridor outside your cell. There was an unusual amount of activity outside Ward 209 that afternoon. Footsteps moving back and forth with more frequency than usual. Voices that sounded urgent and a little disorganized. Kind of institutional disruption that happens when something has gone wrong inside the system and people are trying to manage it without letting the disruption become visible. We pressed close to the door of our cell and listened, but could make out nothing specific. We could only sense that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the prison, that the machinery that had been moving toward our execution with steady efficiency had met some kind of unexpected resistance. We did not know what it was. We could not have known, but we felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds appear, in the pressure of the air, in the special quality of the silence between sounds. What we learned later pieced together from fragments of information that reached us through other prisoners, and eventually through our legal proceedings was this. The IRGC commander who had been assigned to oversee our execution, a man named Colonel Hossein Barati, who had handled the executions of several of the 8 protesters executed in connection with the Mahsa Amini uprising, collapsed suddenly and severely ill on the morning of the day before our scheduled execution. The nature of his illness was never fully explained to us, but by all accounts, it was serious enough to require immediate hospital care and made him completely unable to do his duties. His collapse created an administrative crisis within the execution process because Barati had been the main officer managing the paperwork and logistics of our case. He had the files. He knew the details. He was the link between the Revolutionary Court's verdict and its carrying out. Without him, the process did not simply pause politely and wait for his recovery. It moved forward under the management of a replacement officer who was not familiar with our case and who was handed a stack of files and told to proceed with the scheduled executions without enough time to properly review everything he was being asked to manage. The replacement commander's name was Lieutenant Farrokh Saidkhai. He was not a cruel man by all accounts, simply an overwhelmed one, a mid-level IRGC officer suddenly responsible for paperwork he had not prepared and proceedings he had not followed from the beginning. In his attempt to organize the files and confirm the execution list for the following morning, he made an error. The kind of error that should not be possible in a system that is ending human lives. The kind of error that no careful analysis of bureaucratic chance can fully account for. He mixed our files with those of 2 other prisoners in the condemned section who had been sentenced not to execution but to 5 years of imprisonment. The names were similar enough in the filing system to cause confusion under pressure and under time limits, and without the detailed case knowledge that Barati would have had. Saidkhai processed our files under the wrong classification. He moved our names from the execution list to the imprisonment list. He signed off on the paperwork. He submitted it to the relevant authorities. And with that submission, without any human advocate fighting for us, without any international campaign reaching the right ears, without any legal appeal succeeding where all previous appeals had failed, the death sentence that had been hanging over our heads since January 2024 was administratively changed into a 5-year prison sentence. We did not find out right away. The first sign that something had changed came the following morning, the morning that was supposed to be our last. The door of our cell did not open at the time we had been told to expect. The hour passed, then another hour, then a third. We sat on our mattresses barely breathing, holding each other's hands without speaking, our eyes fixed on the door waiting for the sound of the key in the lock that would tell us our time had come. But the key did not come. Instead, later that morning, a prison official appeared at our cell door and told us in a flat, bureaucratic tone that our sentences had been reclassified by order of the relevant authority and that we would be serving a term of 5 years imprisonment rather than facing execution. He said it the way a man announces a change in a meeting schedule, without drama, without explanation, without any recognition of the size of what he was communicating. He slid a document through the food slot and walked away. Seed picked up the document from the floor and we read it together. Our names, the reclassification, the new sentence, 5 years imprisonment. We read it twice and then a third time, and then Seed set it down on his mattress and covered his face with both hands, and his shoulders began to shake. I put my arm around him and I looked up at the ceiling of that grey concrete cell, and I said out loud in Farsi the words our brother had shown us in the dream. Jesus has saved our lives. The storm is over. We are still serving that 5-year sentence, but we are alive, and every day we remember the dream. Every day we remember the promise we made in the darkness of that cell. We will spend whatever life remains to us telling people what happened. Jesus heard us, Jesus answered, and the storm was over.